from the dance world. So, anyway, today we're going to hear from Kathy Krause, who's a professor of English and medieval studies. French. Oh, what did I say?
Beautiful, Jacob. Thank you.
Professor of French and Medieval Studies at UMKC with the distinction of having been Chair of Foreign Languages, Director of Women's and Gender Studies, Director of Medieval and Early Modern Studies, though only one of it, which is good. One of her proudest accomplishments at UMKC is the Lyon Summer Study Abroad Program, which is now in its 27th year. That's awesome. Her research lies at the intersection of literary, manuscript, and feminist historical studies. She focuses on female inheritance and lordship and its impact on literary production in northern France and Flanders, primarily in the long 13th century. So,
I need to put the focus on.
Okay, and we're going to stop in time to go look at the 89.3% eclipse and come back if necessary, because you have to have the conclusion. Thank you. All right, and I'm going to read mine, which is what we do in languages. All right, one might sum up my research philosophy with the phrase, read the whole damn manuscript. In other words, don't only look at the part of the medieval manuscript that contains the text that you are researching, but look through the entire codex, no matter how unrelated or boring it might appear. This methodology, if you can even call it that, has led to a number of unexpected illuminations, unintended, sorry, over the years. And so what I want to do today is follow the research threads that connect three intriguing old French manuscripts in order to provide a taste of what my research involves and the kind of questions it raises. So one of the first codices that I examined, where I found something unexpected, was in Paris, Arsenal 3142. And to identify manuscripts, the convention is you give the city, so Paris, the name of the library, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which is BNF usually, and then it's shelf marked at that library, since every library has a different system for organizing their books and their manuscripts. So this manuscript is well known both to medieval art historians and to literary scholars, in particular scholars of female patronage, which is why I was looking at it, because of its first illumination, right? Which is pretty sumptuous. Right? It was produced in Paris about 1285, probably for Marie de Brabant. Oh yeah, Marie de Brabant. I think I can see. Queen of France, who was featured prominently. Right, you see her here. Does this have a? Can I go? Lucy? Is there a pointer? I got it. There she is. In the frontispiece, and you can tell it's her by the heraldry, right? She's wearing the on one side the fleur-de-lis of France, and on the other side these are the leopards in gold on black of Brabant. So Aradel and her natal heraldry. In addition to a number of longer, what we would today call fictional works, including those by the King of Minstrels, Adonai le Roi, which means the king, and here he is. You can tell he is Adonai le Roi because he's wearing a crown. And he had come to Paris with Marie de Brabant. The codex also contains a large section of short texts. And among them are a series of religious poems, most of which are dedicated to the Virgin Mary. For example, various paraphrases of Ave Maria, or a poem on the nine joys of Our Lady, etc. Almost all are anonymous, and none is particularly original, which is probably why even scholars who studied the manuscript at some length have paid them very little heed. Even the illuminations that accompany these poems are repetitive, the majority depicting an extremely lifelike statue of the Virgin and Child, and with often a male figure in prayer before her. However, on folio 299 verso, the historiated initial, which is to say it's an initial, it's the first letter of the next word, and it's got a picture in the middle. That's what historiated initial means. The historiated initial clearly depicts a woman. And you can tell that, you can tell thanks to her cloth, her hair, and the fact that the robe goes all the way down to her feet. So you can tell it's a woman. However, the text that follows the initial is one of the multiple poetic glosses and translations of the Ave Maria, and nothing in it calls for the depiction of a woman in an initial instead of the man that you see in all the other ones. So when I found this image, I will admit that my second reaction after an initial glee, a woman, was, oh, dang, now I'm going to have to read all these little texts. It paid off, as I found the corollary to the mismatch of image and voice within this same set of religious poems a few folios earlier. And it is the Salut de Notre Dame en Français, so the Ave Maria in French, on folio 287, in case you care to go look it up someday. And it contains the following verses among typical rhetoric praising the Virgin. And I won't read them, and that's my translation, and that's taken right from the manuscript. As the feminine endings on Mesfet and Pécheresse indicate, right, this prayer is spoken by a woman, by a female voice. However, here the historiated initial that accompanies it shows a man, the typical male figure praying before the Madonna and Child. Is this perhaps the text that the initial of the woman, right, with the woman praying should have been accompanied? I suspect it is, or perhaps that the presence of this poem inspired the depiction of a woman in a later folio by the artist. If we take a brief look, very brief, at the Codex's larger program of illuminations, we can find clues that support this hypothesis. First, as a number of scholars have argued, the illuminations accompanying the majority of the texts in this manuscript are linked to issues of poetic voice, authorship, and authority. For example, right, the frontispiece, here I'm giving you a slightly larger view, right, as we've already seen it, right, has Marie de Brabant reclining with Adonai at her feet, viol in hand. Here he is with his viol. And then seated next to her is her sister-in-law, Blanche de France. And Adonai is then depicted again in the initial, right? Then here he is seated. You can just see his crown against the gold background. And he's writing on wax tablets. That's what you used before you put something to parchment, which was expensive. And so you wrote in wax tablets to begin with. This, that was sort of your initial copy. So the prologue to Adonai's romance tells us that it was in fact Blanche de France who brought this tale back with her. It's originally Arabic, and it tells the story of a flying mechanical horse that's been enchanted, and there's all kinds of adventures. It's lots of fun. And so she brings it back with her from Spain after she was widowed. She was married to the son of Alfonso the Wise, King of Castile, right? And then Marie de Brabant asks Adonai to turn it into a written romance, a formal text. So the miniature thus depicts both authorings of the tale, right? Blanche telling the story to Marie and Adonai turning it into his poem. And I'll just give you one more example of this kind of thing going on in the manuscript. We have in this manuscript Marie de France, right, the author, the first named female author in vernacular, right, not in Latin, in Europe. And here she is shown writing in her fables, which she translates. She translates a version of Aesop's fables. And there's a picture of her doing this at both the beginning and the end of this text in this manuscript. So in this kind of programmatic context, the image of petitioners praying before figures of the Virgin Mary represents the person praying, right, in the text that follows. Just makes sense, right? This is to say the illuminations depict the author of the prayer, whether the actual author or the implied author. The portrait represents the person whose voice we hear in the prayer. Thus, the image of a woman in prayer before the Virgin on folio 299 verso depicts a female voice not only speaking, but also authoring the prayer. And indeed, the first lines of the poem emphasize the poet's craft and highlight the fact that she first wrote the prayer, and the word used is escrit, I put there in red, right? And then translated it from the Latin into the vernacular. So the emphasis on authorship and translation in this prologue correlates with the prominence of the subject in the manuscript as a whole. This short and otherwise undistinguished poem thus contributes to the Codex's overall authorial and feminine emphasis. Marie de Brabant's imposing position in the frontispiece, along with Marie de France's double presence at the beginning and end of the fables, confirms that the manuscript deliberately shows women as well as men participating actively in the process of writing. In addition to their more usual function in medieval society as readers. So the Salut de Notre Dame in the female voice and the probably misplaced image of the woman in prayer corroborate and strengthen a pro-feminine reading of this manuscript. The anonymous female writer takes on the role not only of female translator, as Marie de France claims for her fables, but also of author and poetic petitioner of the Virgin, two functions normally reserved for male clerics. So my work on Arsenal 3142 led me to investigate one of the other religious texts it contains, the theological allegory known as the Dit des Quatre Sœurs, or the tale reads to tell, as opposed to sing. So the Dit, or the tale of the four sisters. And that is dedicated in this manuscript to the noble Countess of Ponthieu. And nearly jumped out of my chair in the reading room when I read that for the first time. But I managed to contain my excitement. The text is one of several old French retellings of the allegory of the four daughters of God, popularized by Saint Bernard, among others. Right? It tells of pity, truth, justice, and peace. Those are the four daughters, or here the four sisters, and their dispute before their father, the king, over the fate of his rebellious seneschal, man, right, who had been sentenced to death for breaking the one commandment the king had set for him. I think the allegory of the fall and redemption are pretty obvious, right? Although the author of the poem didn't think so, he explains it at great length. So in a different manuscript, so one of the other ones, Paris BNF Français 378, so also in Paris at a different library, part of the National Library, number 378. It's another late 13th century manuscript, also produced in or near Paris. The Four Sisters appears in the first section of the Codex, along with a series of short didactic verse texts. Once again, all pretty obscure, even among medievalists. And there you have their names in my very literal translations of the titles. The second, much longer section of the Codex contains the well-known romance Rose. Skipping over any broader discussion of the Codex for lack of time, I'm going to jump right to the miniatures accompanying these short verse texts. Once again, my eye was caught by the presence of a woman in one of the images, and as you can tell, this manuscript has been well used, and many of the pictures are rather worn, but I think you can still see, right? This is the illumination accompanying the second of the Dit des Trois Morts et Trois Vifs, right? The tale of the three dead and the three living, right? And it depicts in a double scene the three dead alongside three living women, right? On the left, we have a nun. There she is, right? With two skeletons with their grave clothes still on them. And on the right, the third of the dead is surrounded by two women, one probably younger, her hair is down. She may also be poorer, right? She's not wearing brightly colored clothing. The other woman has her hair up in a very formal married woman's headdress and wearing brighter clothing. Okay. As we saw with the Salut Notre Dame in the Arsenal manuscript, there is a disconnect here between text and image. In the poem, the three living are very clearly noble men, not women. And in fact, in all 5 known Old French versions of the allegory, including the other version by a known author, Baudouin de Condé, that's also in this manuscript, there are no female characters. what are they doing in this picture? Right? So my interest piqued by this quite prominent disconnect between text and image. I looked more closely at the other miniatures and found 3 other similar gendered iconographic anomalies. First, the images preceding the comparison of the field, allegory of the field, and that of the allegory of the falcon, both depict a woman and a man, but the texts don't contain any female characters. So in the image that goes with the comparison of the falcon, right, you see a man and woman caring for 2 birds of prey. The tale, however, tells of a falcon cherished by a gentleman who kills other birds without mercy. His master shows him off with pleasure at his court, while on the contrary, any rooster or chicken that ventures into the court is chased away. Doesn't that happen every day? However, after death, the falcon is forgotten and his corpse thrown on the dung heap, while the chicken provides a sumptuous meal for the Lord. This anecdote serves to illustrate, rather poorly, I would say, a double lesson. First, about the dangers of excessive and facile love for the outsider, represented by the chicken, right? I mean, the falcon, sorry. And second, about the rich, also represented by the falcon, and the poor, represented by the chicken, and their respective treatment on earth and in heaven. In neither anecdote nor explication do we find any women, unless you count the chicken. All right, similarly, and perhaps even more unexpectedly, the image for the comparison of the field depicts and a cleric, and you can tell it's a cleric by his tonsure, which is really quite excessive here, right? And they're in the woods by a stream. You can see the fishies swimming down in the stream, and their hand gestures indicate that she's talking and he's listening. The allegory begins with a diatribe against the tongue, which sharpens itself to speak evil. And it goes on to enumerate several types of abusive speakers, including those who defame damsels and ladies, the seemingly devout prelates, who teach and chastise the people who are in reality the most lustful of men, and finally the lawyers, who tell lies in order to obtain as much money as they can. Right? Sachons, as we would say that in French, right? Things haven't changed very much since the Middle Ages. So the field of the title, which absorbs the good rain and bears fruit while letting the mud and dirty water run off into a ditch, is then compared to the man who hears and understands the good word that is good and well spoken, while those who reject the good and retain only the filth are like the ditch. Nowhere is there any mention of a nun. The closest we get is the reference to the lust of the hypocritical prelates, who were perhaps being depicted in the miniature via the tonsured male figure holding gloves, because gloves in medieval iconography, right, could be signs of nobility, but they could also be signs of lust. Sort of a shorthand to show that this is a lustful character. But we're still left with more questions than answers. For example, what is the nun saying? Is she rejecting his lustful advances? Or is she seducing him? Or something else entirely going on? Okay, to answer these questions, let me turn to the last iconographic anomaly in the manuscript and another out-of-place nun. The tale of the amorous stag, the cerf amoureux, is a mostly conventional allegorical narrative developing the metaphor of a stag hunt to represent a lover's pursuit of a lady, with the various elements of the hunt, including each of the dogs used by the god of love. In this tale, it is the god of love who does the hunting, and the lover is sort of a passive onlooker. So each of the dogs is glossed as a step in the chase and eventual capture of the lady's heart. Rather unconventionally, however, the love who leads this hunt is female. She's consistently referred to as bonne amour, very shortly. There's a point. There's a reason, right? and the female pronoun, right? She, elle, rather than the more typical masculine god of love that we find, for example, later in the Codex in the Romance of the Rose, very prominently. And to continue the gender bending, the beloved lady is represented by a stag. right? It's the hunt of the stag, or the stag of love, and not a doe. As you can imagine, I would have been overjoyed to find an image of a female god of love assisting a male hunter in the illumination accompanying the text. Instead, you can see why there has to be a little build-up for the picture. We see yet another nun standing by a stag and holding its antler. And it's a very, very poorly preserved picture. It's the only one that's within an initial, but you can clearly see that this is a nun. And you can just see the stag and the antlers and the fact that she seems to be holding on to his antler or her antler. An instance of a woman in a miniature where there shouldn't be one, in the text anyway, could be explained away as artistic license or error. 3, not so easily, and particularly when 2 of them are nuns. I have come to an explanation arises from the existence of the 2 versions of the tale of the 3 dead and the 3 living in this codex. The image accompanying the poem written by Baudouin de Condé shows the standard iconography, right? 3 skeletons on the right-hand frame confront 3 noblemen on the left. And the format is the same, right? Overall, right? There's a double picture as with the other version of the 3 dead and the 3 living. It clearly, right, links the poems by iconography as well as by title and by the subject matter. These are the only 2 texts in the manuscript to have a double image. It covers 2 columns, goes across the whole page. All the others only have a single column miniature, including in the Romance of the Rose, which has many of them, but they're all the single column one. So the 2 texts are thus singled out by their double miniature. In format suggests an interpretation. With the 2 sets of images, one masculine and one feminine, the artist is trying to convey the idea that everyone, men and women, are subject to death and need to heed the lessons of the allegory of the skeletons that tell these guys to repent and fix their ways and think about God. The very costumes of the 3 female figures, as we saw, right, contribute to this view, right, as they form a sort of mini panorama of the female estates, right, a lay woman, a richer one, a younger one, etc. It would be lovely if the same reasoning could easily apply to the other images with women in them, including the judging the figures in the miniature accompanying the comparaison du faucon by their clothing. They are apparently representing a male and female falconer, and by what they're doing, she's actually feeding a falcon. He's got his head stuck in. Interestingly enough, my colleagues who study these things tell me we have no written evidence for women having been falconers. There's lots of examples of women hunting, noble women hunting with falcons, but not of women caring for them. So they're quite intrigued by this picture. The image thus would have no real connection to the specific elements of the text, but well within the norms of text-image relationships in manuscript illumination. And it does allow for this sort of overarching concern of depicting both men and women. What then of the nuns? If we turn back to the comparison of the field, the text moralizes about good and bad speech, condemning bad words of various types for their destructiveness and encouraging the listener to be like the field, right? To be good hearers of good words. The 2 figures are depicted in a setting that could represent the field and the ditch of the allegory. However, given the trees and the fish in the wavy water, it seems more of a locus amenus, right? Which is Latin for pleasant place, and a shorthand both in medieval times and by scholars today to talk about a spot for lovers to hang out and enjoy themselves, or to have pleasure, in which you have pleasure, a pleasure garden. All right. Then a productive farm field, right? Given this, it would appear that the image focuses, as I've said, on the comparison's criticism of hypocritical, lustful churchmen, and we're left to wonder why there is a female religious in the figure. Indeed, as my colleague Virginia Blanton noted when looking at the image with me, both figures are out of place. The nun should be in the cloister, while the cleric should be in the chancery or in a church, certainly not standing in a locus amenus alone with a member of the other sex. Lastly, for this manuscript, we can stop now after this paragraph and go outside. What about the female religious figure in the historiated initial accompanying the Ser Amoureux? Perhaps even more than the nun in the previous image, she's out of place. Given that she's holding the stag's antler, we would appear to be at the end of the hunt when the beloved lady / stag has been caught. So is the nun standing in for bon amour, good love, or for the male lovers? Allowing for some serious stretching of the imagination, we might see the stag as Christ, which was a reasonably common allegorical representation in the Middle Ages, and the nun thus as having caught her beloved, thereby thoroughly reversing the allegory's gender bending. And with that, I return to the idea that the Codex's artistic program is trying to include both men and women in order to ensure, as it were, that the lessons of the allegories are seen as applicable to all. Taking this one step further, the inclusion of female religious figures, to the point of putting them in scenes that don't correspond at all with the text, would suggest that the Codex may have been addressed to a nun, or had retired to a religious house but not taken vows, which was a typical retirement community sort of setting in the Middle Ages. And while I can prove none of this, this latter seems the best fit with the Codex as a whole, given the decidedly worldly contents of the Romance of the Rose that we find later. We've seen one codex addressed to a queen, another to a female religious, if my hypothesis holds. And in both cases, care was taken to include images of women, even images of the woman to whom the codex was addressed. And this fits, right, with artistic tendencies of the period. Owners, for example, are often depicted within their psalters or books of hours. Donors of church art, whether stained glass windows or paintings, regularly appear in them, often as small figures, right, in the lower register of the images. So another way in which addressees, whether they themselves ordered the manuscript or it was given to them as a gift, are often included in manuscripts is via heraldry. And my last codex has a notable example of this. As with my previous segues between manuscripts, this one follows one of the texts, to wit, the Dit du Cerf Amoureux, the amorous stag, to another manuscript, one of the manuscripts that contains it, right? Given that image of the nun and the stag, how could one not go look to see what the other manuscripts would have? This led me to Paris Bayonet Français 25566, another large compilation codex, as you can see from the number of texts in it, and another one that raises more questions than answers. This particular codex was produced in Arras, so north of France, in the early years of the 14th century, so some 25 years approximately after the other two that we looked at. And as with the other two manuscripts, I'm going to focus my attention on the short tales that are grouped together towards the end of the codex. And this is the whole contents, and here are the short tales. Right? You see there's 11, that's a long one, then these are all short, and then there's a set of poems at the end, some of which seem to fit with the others, but you can they end with the congé, which is to say the goodbye poem. So the codex ends with poems saying goodbye by the poet. Similar to the Arsenal manuscript, several of the D in Français 25566 are preceded by an image of a figure speaking the text that follows. Here you have 3 examples, and in these 3 examples in particular, the person speaking is depicted as a university professor. Right? He's wearing a soft, squishy hat. And that is the mark, this sort of soft hat here, of a professor or a master. So this is a master teaching whoever, students. And usually is here holding a scroll which represents the voice, what is being spoken. Almost all the rest feature a male figure teaching or talking to, or in a few cases, just looking at a second figure, whether that be another person or an animal or the object. And here are just 3 examples, right? You have with the tale of the stolen lamb, talking to a lamb, the tale of the lamb, you've got the guy talking to the lambs, pointing to them in any case. And once again, in the, this one also has a copy of the tale of the falcon, the allegory of the falcon, and here he seems to be aiming at the falcon, perhaps getting ready to do something. Okay. right, we have 3 versions. They all have, sort of minimum background. It's gold, but there's no, interest to it and very minimal decor. If you look at, there are 3 versions of the 3 living, or the 3 dead and the 3 living in this manuscript. And here again, you don't have much imagination, right? The 3 dead are exactly the same. I love the smiley faces. And the 3 living are quite similar in the colors of their robes and the way that this body is arched, etc. And even in the longer texts, which are by the same artist, they also tend to be very minimal pictures. Choice, right, just doesn't seem to have been very exciting. It suggests an unimaginative artist or patron or the person who compiled the whole manuscript, or maybe all 3. Then, however, we turn to the illumination illustrating the Dit du cerf amoureux, right, the amorous stag, or as it's called here, just the stag hunt. And we see something quite different by a very different artist, I might add as well. It's a full page. The others are, small 1 column. Right? This one takes up the entire folio, about the manuscript's about this big. It's the antithesis, right, of those small images accompanying the other D. When they are spare and static, this page overflows with details and movement. And it depicts, right, the heat of the chase, the female stag, and I'll zoom in on her here. And you can see it's a woman with antlers on a body of a deer. Right? So the female stag is fleeing before the god of love, although here he is a male god of love, and in the text, in this manuscript, it is very much still a female god of love. And it really, I think this image highlights the real violence of the chase and the emotion experienced by the hunted woman stag, who looks back, perhaps fearfully, towards the god of love as the dogs are about to overtake her. The artist left the lover out of the image entirely, which follows the text, as it repeatedly notes and even insists that love does the hunting and not the lover. But unlike the text, on the other hand, the artist, or whoever designed this illumination, added an audience in the top register. Right, we see 3 women and 2 men actively engaged with both each other and with the scene they're watching, as their hand gestures indicate. So the allegorical hunt is here staged as entertainment for the court. The addition of spectators creates a sort of mise en abîme, right, of the text, right, of performing the deed itself, the poem coming to life, as it were, before its audience. More specifically for the thread I have been following today, this full page miniature puts woman and women back front and center, both in the guise of the female stag and in the audience. And it is not the only full page miniature to do so. There are 2 others in the codex. There are 3 total. One towards the end of the long text known as Renard le Nouvel, the new Renard, Renard meaning fox. It's a beast allegory, and the fox is the wily main character. And this is a new rewrite of the story. And the other accompanies the tale of the 4 evangelists. In both, as in this image, female figures occupy the central register. So in Renard le Nouvel, you have in the middle, and I'll show you that here, right? That's Lady Fortune, right? She's turning her wheel, and people are going up and down with their position in the world. And in the 4 evangelists, what a great image, right? The lady in the middle, it represents the church. She is ecclesia, right? And she is, there are other women in all these images, right? Here, ecclesia is spearing synagogue, so Old Testament, New Testament, and then the 4 heads of the 4 evangelists on the beast. It's somewhat surreal, right, as an image. And in Renard le Nouvel, right, we have laid, I think that should be the next. Well, here they are all 3, so you can see them together. Renard le Nouvel, there are women. There's 1 up in the top, and then there are 2 here who are charity and humility, who are not being dealt very well in the world today, according to the text. All three of these illuminations are in fact on thicker parchment than the rest of the codex, and they are inserted into the codex with parchment tabs, which is to say that we cannot know whether they were added to the codex at the time of production or somewhat later. Now they are contemporary in terms of style with the rest of the codex. Right? So the art historian Alison Stones suggests that the patrons whose coats of arms appear only on these three illuminations and somewhat obsessively, as I will show you in more detail in a little bit, right, that the patrons may have commissioned and then added these images to sort of a off-the-shelf, ready-made codex that they could buy cheaply, sort of cheaply, right, at their local bookseller, and that they chose the text to illuminate, thus indicating which were the most important to them. I want to suggest a parallel line of reasoning. The heraldic devices on the three full-page miniatures are those of the lords of Hongest, or at least that's who we think they are, because it's the only family perhaps that we've found at the appropriate time who bears that coat of arms, and much more obviously to us today, the Counts of Flanders, and you can see them, right, there's the Counts of Flanders, right, so they have the lion sable, black on a gold background, as opposed to Brabant where it's reversed. And the Lords of Hongest, the easiest one to see is probably this one. It's silver, that's just oxidized, with a red cross, and there are 5 gold shells on top of the red. However, we have not found any indication, right, of a link between these two families, because this kind of paired heraldry in a manuscript generally indicates the union of two noble families via marriage. Right, noble women, right, adopted, as we saw with Marie de Brabant, right, the party, one half her family, one half his family arms. People would then start splitting them even more, right, to show all their various very important relatives. But when you have two like this, it indicates almost all the time that there's a marriage between the two families, and we can find no evidence of a marriage between those two families at this time. So we're not quite sure what to do with it, but for my purposes, happily, whose union is celebrated in the images is not as important as the fact that one of them was a woman. She, or the person who commissioned the images and their placement in this codex for her and her husband, would then be the one responsible for ensuring that women's images were not absent from the codex, but instead prominent and indeed even visually dominant in it. So in conclusion, the threads that connect these three manuscripts are at least double. First, they all contain a section of short, mainly but not exclusively didactic, not always religious, sometimes courtly, as we saw with the Hunt, right? Verse texts in Old French. And indeed, we find the same text in at least two of the three manuscripts, right? But we never find one single text that's in all three of them. This is, right, not an uncommon situation. Given the cost of materials and of labor, manuscripts were very expensive, and they served as sort of mini libraries. You very rarely just got a manuscript with one text in it. It happens, but there are many, many examples of this kind of compilation manuscript. However, what is unexpected is the second thread. As we've seen, all three offer examples of a gendered mismatch in some way between the images and the text they accompany. And that mismatch strongly points to a female owner and to female participation in the littering process. The anonymous female author of the Salut Notre-Dame en François, along with Marie de Brabant and Marie de France in Arsenal 3142, and as yet unidentified daughter of the Flanders or Hengist families, present by her coat of arms in Francais 25566, or the female religious appearing in such unexpected places in Francais 378. Thank you.
I'm wondering about the animals are on the who are hovering over the top. Because I'm wondering if they too might have some heraldic significance, and some of them are normal, like squirrels and birds, and some of them are dragons, and not sure what that Kimara in the middle is doing.
Yeah. You know, and there are animals down here as
Yeah, there are
well.
lots of bunnies.
Right, there's,
And especially the bunnies, which usually is.
well, they want the young couple to be
Right,
fruitful.
yes, exactly.
That's what
And
bunnies are
multiply
for.
a lot. Yeah.
These are for sex and reproduction. You know, the other ones, you know, I don't know. No one that I know who's talked about it has said anything.
I know, the more.
I don't have the mic on anymore, and I know it's being taped all over. Yeah, so I don't know. No one's said anything about, these are just so obvious, the actual coats of arms, and so repeated on all of these three. But it's driving art historians up the wall that they can't figure
They
out.
can't identify an actual marriage.
Yeah, and I found a couple of other coats of arms, other families other than Onges that had something like the Red Cross unsilvered
And the Santiago scallops.
in the Santiago scallops, but no, but I can't find any evidence that any of them married into the, you know, Commodore family of Flanders. Very beginning of the 14th century. So Flanders and Hainaut are ruled by the same person,
Right.
but it didn't matter, it's the same family, even if they split it. But so these arms were used by both. Whereas the Onges or any of the others I found are much lower in the, you know, hierarchy. And Flanders is about as, you know, big as you can get without being the king of France or Holy Emperor.
I can't remember, it's not the Warrens. Might be the Prince.
I will keep digging just for the fun of it, even if for my argument for the sake of, you know, who might have owned this manuscript. I'm mostly interested in the fact that it was a woman. And clearly somebody said, there are no women in those small pictures. You have to have some women. Become big. It wasn't like someone said, oh, we really should put some religious pictures in there. No, we'll put one for a religious text. In the longer version of this, they represent the three different kinds of allegory that are going on in the Codex. If I go back here, right, you have, this is obviously religious allegory, the four evangelists. Here we have courtly love allegory. And Renal Nouvelle is social and political satire. It's quite a scathing rebuke of the policies of the then King of France and the situation at the royal court. So that would be, you know, sort of using allegory for
Which thing was that?
Philippe le Bel. He dies. It's written when he's the king. By the time the manuscript is made, he may no longer be king. I can't remember. Philip the Fair in English.
Yeah. So
It's 4 and 4. Yes, I know them by their other names. And Philip the Second, I know.
Yeah.
Philip Augustus. Any other questions?
thank you, Ken.
Yeah.